how comfortable Carney is at these events with other world leaders and dignitaries?
Well, the outcome is the tougher part of that question. I mean, I do think he's had a good outing on the world stage. He's incredibly comfortable. This setting of world leader fits him like a glove.
When America's ambassador to Canada tried to score points by calling Canadians ungrateful,
the most unexpected. And we're going to get right into the meat of the stuff that we want to talk about today, okay? I'm disappointed that I came to Canada, a Canada that it is very, very difficult to find Canadians who are passionate about the American-Canadian relationship.
The response he got was anything but quiet. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't sidestep the insult. He turned it into a direct challenge, laying bare the unease brewing south of the border.
It's not just of the United States, but in the interests of the Canadian people is not on the table. But it's still possible. What is the fact is that Canada and Mexico have the best actual trading relationship, trading agreements with the United States.
His words carried the weight of defiance, a reminder that Canada is no longer content to be treated as a junior partner in someone else's game. What unfolded wasn't a diplomatic sparring match, but a battle over dignity, influence, and power. And the real question is, did Washington underestimate the neighbor it thought it could control? The tension between Washington and Ottawa took center stage when US Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra began making public remarks that sounded less like diplomacy and more like scolding. Twice in a single week, he lamented what he saw as Canada's lack of enthusiasm for its relationship with the United States. He claimed that Washington had hoped for far more than the renegotiated CUSMA agreement, speaking of ambitions that reached into steel, critical minerals, energy, and nuclear cooperation. Yet in his telling, those ambitions were left unfulfilled because Canada had not matched America's appetite. It was a calculated attempt to cast Canada as small-minded, unwilling to step up, and lacking in passion for the partnership. The ambassador didn't stop there. He went further, airing disappointment not only with Ottawa's leaders, but with the Canadian public itself. He accused ordinary Canadians of showing indifference toward the US, saying the business community still held enthusiasm, but regular people did not. It was an extraordinary statement suggesting that a neighbor of over a century in alliance and trade had somehow become ungrateful and cold. But his words carried less the weight of truth than the frustration of a country watching influence slip away. What Hoekstra failed to mention was the real cause behind the cooling. It was not that Canadians suddenly forgot the importance of cross-border trade or shared history. It was that trust had been eroded by years of hostility under Donald Trump's leadership. Tariffs on steel and aluminum had hit Canadian industries hard. Canada's Prime Minister had been dismissed as a governor and treated with open disdain. The relationship, long thought unshakable, was dragged through insults, trade wars, and disregard for sovereignty. In that environment, Canadians were not ungrateful. They were wary. Washington had burned bridges, and now it was surprised when people stopped crossing them. When Prime Minister Mark Carney was asked to respond to the ambassador's remarks, the answer was sharp yet measured. He didn't flail or react emotionally. Instead, he made 3 points clear. First, the grand deal Hoekstra spoke of is not currently on the table. Second, Canada already has one of the strongest trade arrangements with the United States and Mexico, which functions as a fair and practical framework. And third, any expansion of that relationship will only happen if it aligns with Canadian interests. That was the key message. Canada will not sign agreements to serve Washington's goals at its own expense. Carney's response resonated because it was more than a rebuttal. It was a declaration of principle. A deal, he explained, has to work for both sides. That is not obstructionism, it is sovereignty. In trade and diplomacy, the real test of leadership is not how many agreements are signed, but whether those agreements protect the nation's workers, industries, and long-term stability. His calm delivery carried strength precisely because it was not defensive. He reminded both Canadians and Americans that Canada has leverage, and leverage changes the balance of power. Tone matters in diplomacy. Washington often thrives on stirring conflict, escalating pressure, and forcing reactions. Trump and his envoys excelled at creating drama to unsettle counterparts. But Carney gave them no such victory. His tone was composed, his words deliberate, his position unshakable. That calmness has its own power because it unsettles those who expect to dominate with chaos. Instead of being dragged into Washington's game, Ottawa set its own terms. The reassurance at home was just as important. Canadians remembered vividly how tariffs threatened their livelihoods and how America's erratic policies left families and industries exposed. Carney's words signaled a decisive break from that vulnerability. He told Canadians their government will not bow to the same bullying again. Those days are over. That message matters because sovereignty is not abstract. It touches paychecks, industries, and the security of communities across the country. Yet his answer was not a door slammed shut. By saying that a larger deal was not on the table right now, Carney left room for future negotiation. That phrasing was deliberate. It preserved leverage. It told Washington, Canada is not desperate. If you want something more, you must bring terms that respect equality. In other words, the starting point is not submission, but strength. Canada already has a functioning framework. If the US wants more, it must earn it. This is why Hoekstra's complaint rang hollow. While the ambassador sounded frustrated, Carney sounded confident. One spoke like a neighbour chastising another for lacking enthusiasm. The other spoke like a leader laying out boundaries and priorities. For Canadians, that contrast mattered deeply. It meant their leadership was not allowing Washington to dictate the conversation. Instead, Ottawa was speaking directly to its citizens, making it clear that their interests come first. The symbolism was unmistakable. Canada, long viewed by some in Washington as the junior partner, showed it was no longer willing to be lectured or cornered. Respect had to be mutual, or there would be no new agreements. For Canadians who had lived through years of uncertainty, that stance reinforced faith in leadership. Carney was not afraid to say no, and saying no with confidence is often the strongest position in diplomacy. The larger strategy behind his words reflects how Canada has positioned itself in the modern era. The country has broadened trade ties with Mexico, deepened relationships with Europe, and sought opportunities in Asia. At the same time, it has invested in domestic strength, critical minerals, energy resilience, and agricultural capacity. These moves reduce reliance on Washington and create real choices. And when a country has choices, it gains power. That is what Washington is struggling with. Canada can walk away without fear. The US may continue to push. It may continue to demand more from its northern neighbour. But the lesson from this episode is that the tactics of the past no longer work. Canada has changed. Its alliances are broader, its economy more resilient, its leadership more prepared to say no. Washington's playbook of pressure and dominance has lost much of its effect. So, when Hoekstra voiced disappointment, he was not revealing Canadian weakness. He was revealing American frustration. The United States wants passion, deference, and easy wins from its neighbour. What it is getting instead is defiance and self-confidence. The irony is that America's disappointment is not about Canada failing to show enthusiasm, it is about Canada refusing to play the role Washington expected. And that is why Mark Carney's stance matters. His words made clear that Canada will sign agreements only when they serve its people, that it will protect its industries and workers, and that it will not bow to double standards. What Hoekstra thought would be a pressure tactic has instead exposed American desperation. Canada, in contrast, looks steady, confident, and firm in its sovereignty. The fight unfolding here is not merely about trade, it is about dignity, respect, and Canada's place in the world. Mark Carney made sure that line was visible to everyone watching, and that is why this wasn't a reply to Hoekstra, it was a message to Trump himself. The days of bullying Canada are over. Moreover, in another news, Donald Trump's latest declaration has ignited one of the fiercest disputes ever witnessed in US-Canada relations. Speaking from Washington, he framed Canada's rivers as untapped reserves waiting to be claimed, a solution that he argued could rescue drought-stricken states and stabilize farms and cities across the American West. His focus was the Columbia River, stretching more than 2,000 kilometers from British Columbia into the Pacific Northwest. What made his words explosive was the timing. They came just as negotiations to modernize the Columbia River Treaty of 1961, a long-standing agreement balancing flood control and hydroelectric benefits, were underway. In an instant, Trump shifted the subject from cooperation to confrontation, turning shared waters into bargaining chips and signaling that survival at home would now justify reaching across the border for Canada's lifelines. The reaction in Ottawa was immediate and fierce. Advocacy groups, Indigenous nations and environmental organizations united in opposition, warning that surrendering control of rivers would open the door to consequences far beyond one treaty. More than 80 coalitions spoke out, casting Trump's demand as an outright assault on sovereignty. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who had built his reputation on financial leadership rather than fiery rhetoric, delivered an unusually firm response. He declared that Canada's rivers and lakes would never be for sale, nor treated as commodities for foreign governments. His words were sharp, final and unmistakable. Within hours, routine negotiations hardened into an international standoff, watched with growing unease across North America and beyond. For the United States, the cost of Canada's refusal appeared quickly. Western states that had been banking on fresh supplies of water to secure harvests and keep communities afloat suddenly found themselves facing the same unrelenting drought. California, Nevada, and Arizona were hit the hardest. In the Central Valley, the hub of America's fruit and vegetable production, farmers who had been told to expect new flows from the north instead looked out over dry canals and shrinking reservoirs. Promises collapsed into dust, and with them came a sense of betrayal. That betrayal spread because California does not feed itself alone. It feeds the nation. Nearly 40% of America's vegetables and 2/3 of its fruits and nuts come from those fields. Without water, yields declined. Supermarket prices climbed. Families already strained by inflation saw the cost of food rise even higher, while shortages of staples like lettuce, almonds, and tomatoes began to ripple through global supply chains. What began as a political statement in Washington had now reached the dinner tables of ordinary households, a direct link between high-level diplomacy and everyday life. Agriculture was the first to suffer, but far from the last. Trump had spoken of Canadian water not only as a salvation for farms, but also as fuel for industry and technology. Businesses had taken those assurances seriously. In Arizona, semiconductor plants that consume tens of millions of gallons of water each week had been told relief was on the horizon. Energy companies, hydro-reliant manufacturers, and resource-intensive facilities across the Midwest and Pacific Northwest anticipated similar support. Canada's refusal shattered those expectations. Production slowed, shifts were cut, and supply chains braced for shortages that could affect electronics, automobiles, and even defense equipment. Politically, the optics were damaging. Trump had built his image on strength and independence, pledging to end reliance on others. Yet Canada, a smaller neighbor, had refused outright, leaving Washington exposed. His suggestion that even the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement could be sacrificed rattled millions more. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, which depend on the lakes for drinking water, suddenly faced the possibility that protections long taken for granted could be swept away in a moment of political bargaining. Confidence that international agreements were untouchable dissolved almost overnight. The long-standing assumption that access to Canadian water was secure is gone, and with it, a key pillar of American confidence. Hit like and subscribe for more. Thanks for tuning in.